All right. You know, yesterday, you guys are lucky. I did a 40-minute video. And I noticed in playback that apparently the lens fogged up or something somewhere, because by the time I got done with the first 4 or 5 minutes of the video, all you seen was a yellow blur, because there was so much moisture either in the camera, behind the lens, or whatever. And I noticed that I was doing a lot of it was cleared up for a while. You know, it's a nasal drip thing, allergies, who knows, but for some reason it came back yesterday. So, saved. Saved by the bell. Anyway, what I was basically doing, let me get this phone out of my pocket. Is that a phone in your pocket? Or are you happy to see me? There. Kleenex, just in case the lens starts to fog up. I started talking a little bit more about antennas and such, and I actually soldered on a joint, a connector that I didn't need to do. I actually had to cut this wire, cut a connector off to put a connector on, so I can show you how to do it. So, anyway, so much for that video. But I think you'll see the pin. If not, I'll have to do it over again with marker. Let's talk about a car and an antenna, or a vehicle and an antenna, one more time, real short. If we have our car, or our van, or our truck, in this case, let's call it a car, and here's our hood, and our windshield, and our little trunk, okay? This would be the roof part. Let's put our little hood emblem here. Anyway, we got a car. Naturally, the best place to put an antenna on any vehicle is dead center. The next thing you have to make sure is when you're placing an antenna on a vehicle that the vehicle is not fiberglass. Because if it's fiberglass, you have to buy a special antenna for it. You need an antenna, that's what they call a non-ground planing antenna. Because most of your antennas out there are a ground type plane, to where they need the ground plane, meaning your car. And the car has to be tin, metal, iron, blah 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 blah, okay, in order for it to work. If you take an antenna that's made to go on a car or a vehicle that's acting as a ground, and you put it on a fiberglass car, you're going to blow up your radio. You're going to blow what they call the final output transistor. They call it a PA, power amplifier. The IC, you know, depending on who's working on it, but regardless, it's not going to transmit anymore. Plus, you're not going to hear all that well to start off with, unless there's somebody right on top of you. Your noise level is going to be low, and you're going to notice these things. That's all there is to it. So, you want to make sure that you have the right antenna for the right car. Now, the self-grounding, the non-ground plane type antennas for fiberglass vehicles don't transmit as well as the standard ground type, because you don't have as large of a ground plane, because here we're using part of the car. The car is the ground portion part of the antenna. The antenna is the hot side. When I say hot, I don't mean like if you touch it, it's hot, or if you put it against something, it's going to spark. But it does have RF floating around on it. So, but that's the hot side. And when you mount it, you have to make sure that the antenna is isolated from the ground. And we'll get into that in a minute. Now, a lot of cars are metal, but they have fiberglass trunks and hoods. So if you're going to buy what they call a trunk mount, one that lips on the trunk, if you look at the bottom of it, it has a two little like lip, and it has little Allen screws that screw up into the trunk, and it catches on the lip of the trunk. That's called a lip mount, trunk mount. Well, if you put that on a fiberglass trunk, it's not going to work for you. Again, you're going to blow up your radio. So you want to make sure that if you buy an antenna that requires a ground, that you are attaching it to metal. Now you can't just take a piece of wire and put it to this mount on a fiberglass trunk and expect that to ground. It's going to ground, but it's not going to give you sufficient ground. In order to make that work at all, you would probably have to have like a 3 or a 4-inch piece of copper tucked underneath this thing, going down the trunk lid inside and then down into the frame someplace. Because it's just a piece of wire is not going to do it. It's not like a hot and negative, hot and ground on 12 volts. Your grounds for transmitting from off of an antenna to radiate off of has to be sufficient. I'm talking heavy duty grounds here. Like I say, if you just run a little 10 gauge wire, or a grounding strap or something like that, from that down to ground someplace, you might as well just not run it at all, because again, it's got to be wide and short. You want your grounds as short as possible. That's why you want it mounted to the car. All right? If you got to start running ground wires, get a non-ground plane antenna. You're not going to talk as far. It's not going to take any extra power if you decide to put an amplifier in line, but you're going to save your radio, and you're going to be able to use the CB when you're at least on the highway, or doing some type of talking late at night, or whatever the case may be. Noise level has a lot to do with that, but we'll talk about that another time. So, the right antenna for the right vehicle. Don't try to substitute. Now, placement plays a good part and a big part as well. If you put the antenna in the center, and let's just say, for instance, you're driving through city blocks, and it goes like this. Do you guys see that? Let me see. Yeah, I see it. All right. Okay. Excuse me. And if I have the antenna in the center of the vehicle, my ground plane is going to be, my pattern is going to be pretty even. So if I'm talking to you over here, as I'm driving around, more than likely my pattern is going to stay within the vicinity, so you're going to hear me pretty good regardless of which way my vehicle is facing. I may waver a little bit, but you're not going to see a lot of wavering. Not unless there's big tall buildings there, and we'll get into that. Now if I put the antenna, for instance, over here, and let's just say I'm transmitting this way. Now when I'm driving this way, and if you're over here, I'm transmitting this way. When I start to turn down here, my transmit's going to hit you fine. When I'm coming this way, now again, I'm over here, so I'm transmitting this way. You follow? Now as I start coming around this way and this way again, I'm hitting you again. You see where I'm going here? If it's the opposite, well then as I'm coming up this way, it's going that way. If I'm coming down this way, then you got me all that route there. All right, and then you'll have me on all this route and all this route, but you're going to lose me when I start going this way, because now I'm transmitting that way. So you may lose me completely, or I just may drop down to where you may or may not hear me. Who knows? So the placement of the antenna means a lot. Again, if you're using a ground type of antenna where you need the ground plane. If you're using a non-ground planing type antenna, it doesn't make too much of a difference. Now, when you're placing the antenna, even though you're placing it on a vehicle that's gotten a lot of metal on it, like for instance, I put mine on the bumper. The bumper is attached through these big old straps and bumper mounts, so it's okay. I'm not just running some ground wires. Is it as good as if it was through the roof? No. But when is it good versus practical? Bleh. I don't want to put a 100-inch whip or a 102-inch whip, 96 inches, 102 with a spring, on the roof of a van. It's just not practical. All right, would that be the best? Yeah, but it's not practical. Even like a K40 or a Wilson 500 or a Wilson 1000 on the roof of the van, they've got like a 40-inch whip on them. Is it practical? Not really. Will it work? Oh, it'll work great. And it'll be a lot better than using the 102-inch whip, and it'll probably transmit much better. All right, but you know, again, you got to kind of weigh out what's what. Now, I put my antennas on the roof, but I also pay attention, not my 11 meter, the CB antennas on the bumper, but my 2 meter 440 and things like that I put on the roof because they're shorter. All right, so I can get away with it, and that's the best place. But if I was going to put it on, for instance, a hood or a front fender, the hood, again, we want to make sure it's metal. If not, instead of having a trunk mount that would fit on most hoods, we're going to take inside the hood, open it up, and on the inner wall, if we're looking on the inner wall of the fender, okay, and the hood's back here, the motor's facing us in here, I can put a plate down in here, stick it up a little bit, and I can bolt it into the fender here, because when the hood closes, it'll be in that little seam, that crack between the hood and the fender. Then I can put my antenna on this. So there's ways of getting around it. But, again, if I put it here, I'm going that way. Now let's just say, for instance, somebody had mentioned a tire mount, a tire rack. So if we're on the back of the vehicle, and we have our tire rack, which usually has a connector here, sometimes it comes down like this, and then you got your hinges. Now, this is where it gets kind of touch and go. When it's on that rack, we're relying on the grounding through the hinges and the latch. So how tight is this hinge and latch system? That's going to be a big difference. Now, it's almost the same as a hinge on a trunk or a hood. You can say, well, they both have latches and they both have hinges. Well, they do. But most of the time, if you look at it, you got the spring on the hood, on the hinges. So the springs are always attached. So you've got a little bit better chance of keeping a tight ground. Where on some of these things that just swing out, they're not attached. And a lot of times they'll have a piece of nylon inside the hinge so that the hinge can swing back and forth, which means that's totally isolated from the vehicle to start with. You follow me? So now we're down to possibly one ground point, which is there. So this would work good if I just wanted to put an antenna on for receiving. All right, if I just want to receive something, shortwave. I just want to receive. AM, FM radio. I just want to receive. But personally, I wouldn't trust a transceiver or an antenna that's going to transmit there. Excuse me, guys, I'm starting to get that cough again. Now, if I was going to run a 2 meter antenna, I can probably get away with putting a quarter wave 2 meter antenna here because the mount that I'm mounting it to is actually a sufficient enough ground for 2 meter. Even though it's still going to do better if it's on the roof. But again, for 11 meter, 10 meter, HF stuff, that's not going to work. CB, personally, I wouldn't do it. Like I say, this hinge has probably got nylon bushings in it to make it so it opens and closes easier, which again, we only have one ground point. So you're attaching it to metal, but the metal's not attached to the car or the vehicle. So that is to me would be taking your chances. Right? And then you're also going to be shooting right out the front of the car or the vehicle, which is okay too. You're directional. If you're traveling the highway and you just want it for highway traveling, or you're going to be sitting someplace, or you're not going to be driving through cities, tall buildings, well then that's fine. So the direction may not make a big difference at that point. As long as you're getting the oncoming traffic. So if there's a traffic jam or something, you can talk to the oncoming traffic to find out what's going on in front of you. You really don't care what's going on behind you as much as you do what's going on in front of you. So you want that oncoming traffic. So that's kind of how placement works. Alright, and again, if it's a non-ground plane type antenna made for a fiberglass vehicle, well, it doesn't make too much of a difference, but you want to try to keep it above the vehicle as much as possible. You know, you don't want to put a 3-foot antenna on the bumper, for instance, and then have it stuck up here, because that's not going to work for you at all. You're just transmitting into your truck or your car, your vehicle, whatever it is. You know, it's just not going to happen. You know, I got my whip on there, and that sticks up above it, but the lower part of it, basically, it's there, it's transmitting, but, you know, I've got a little bit of reflective here, so it's not doing as good as if it was open. All right? So that's kind of how that works. Now, let's talk about antennas for a minute. We've already established that the body of the vehicle is the best place. On my van, if I wanted not to use the bumper and I didn't want to use the hood or the trunk, or I mean the roof, I can open up the hatch, and on the inside of the hatch, you know, like that, if you got the hatch and then you actually got the van, well, that little gap in there, I can open up the hatch, I can screw a bracket into the side of that, so I'm bolted right into the side. If the hatch closes, it's going to clear that bracket, and I can put my antenna on that bracket there, you know, and have it 3-4 feet above. If I got a 3 or 4 foot antenna, put that up there, something like that. Attaching it to the body is always your best. Anyway, let's talk about antennas for a minute. Let's take, for instance, a whip. All right, 102 inch. Well, 102 inches with the spring. Normally it's 96 inches or so. So let's take a quarter wave. A steel whip is a quarter wavelength. Quarter wavelength for 11 meters is 9 feet. So you try to get to close to that 9 feet as possible. Grape juice. Anyway, quarter wave. Then there's your half wave. Then they have 5/8 waves, 3/4 waves, full waves, all right, 1 1/4 waves. You know, it starts getting ridiculous, to be honest with you. Forget all this up here. It's not going to be any benefit to you unless you're on top of a mountain in the middle of the desert someplace. Quarter wave, what's it do? Here's my vehicle. Here's my quarter wave antenna. Quarter wave antenna shoots up high and comes down short. So for instance, if I'm driving through the mountains of Kentucky, you know, and I'm down in the valleys and I'm driving around, this antenna is going to be the best thing for me because it's going to shoot over the mountains. It's going to go high and come down short. So that's what's going to happen. Boop, 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 boop. Signal. All right, that's what happens. Quarter wave shoot high, land short. Half wave, they don't shoot as high, but they go out a little further. So half wave is one of your most popular antennas, okay, because of the way it works. So that's going to work in some mountains areas, you know, not naturally as high a mountains, or if you're like right in the middle of Broadway in New York City, you know, this is probably not going to work too well for you, right? You know, but at that point, you kind of get what I'm talking about. 3/4 wave is not going to go as high as the half, but it's going to go out further yet. So again, depending on location, you know, where you're going to be, where you live, where you travel, is also going to have a lot to do with the antenna. There's no sense having an antenna that's going to shoot way out here if it can't get over the mountain. You follow? So the quarter wave is going to work best for you. Full wave, we're going all the way. However, unless you live in a desert and there's nothing around you for miles and miles and miles, you know, this really isn't going to do too much for you. Or unless you can get high. Now, if you're using a base antenna, it's totally different stories because we can get high. But then again, how high can you go safely where it becomes practical? You know, to put an antenna 200 feet in the air, if it's not safe, well, then it's not worth putting 200 feet in the air, even though you're going to transmit like crazy, possibly, because 200 feet of signal, your antenna wire, you're going through all that wire. So you're taking basically, we're going to say 4 watts, which is the legal limit, 4 watts of output power, key, not audio. All right, and at that point, by the time that 4 watts starts traveling up 200 feet of coax, you're lucky if you have 1.5 watts, 2 watts at the top. It's almost like your car. You may have a 400 horsepower engine, but what do you got at the axles? You follow? Well, it's the same thing with the radio by the time it gets out, you know. So that's another thing. So wavelength of the antennas also plays a big part in the antenna. How much time do I have here? 20 minutes. I'm going to stop here. I'll edit and try to get it shorter. I'm going to turn it off and start a part 2.